particularly at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today so early in the morning for this event on Crimea, reflecting on 3 years of Russian occupation. For those of you who may be following us online, you can follow the conversation at AC Eurasia or hashtag Future Ukraine. 3 years ago, on March 18, 2014, Russia illegally annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, following a methodical military takeover. With this action, the Russian Federation revised European borders by force for the first time since World War II and upended the post-Cold War international order. Russia also broke the Budapest Memorandum, a 1994 agreement which it signed guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. Today's event is an opportunity to reflect on the situation in occupied Crimea and the continued implications for international security. In many ways, the peninsula has become an information vacuum, as the Kremlin has sought to repress independent media, stifle voices of opposition, in particular focusing on the Crimean Tatars, who have been leading the opposition against Russian occupation. In addition, Russia has militarized the peninsula by stationing military conventional forces there, and some experts suspect that there may be nuclear missiles stationed in Crimea already as well. The U.S. has vowed to keep sanctions on Russia over the annexation of Crimea in place until Moscow returns control of the peninsula to Kiev. Just last month, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, expressed her strong condemnation for Russia's actions in eastern Ukraine, stating that Crimea is part of Ukraine. Bipartisan congressional efforts have been critical in keeping the attention on this important issue, and that is why we're here today. Congressman Connolly and Congressman Shabbat have recently reintroduced, in January of this year, House Resolution 463, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act. This resolution will codify U.S. policy of non-recognition towards Crimea, and it is an important bipartisan effort in this era of increasing political polarization. And from the expert point of view of the Atlantic Council, it deserves full congressional support. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Congressman Shabbat, the Republican Congressman for Ohio's 1st District, and Congressman Jerry Connolly, the Democratic Congressman for Virginia's 11th District. So Congressman Shabbat, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Polyakova. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. And my good friend Jerry Connolly from Virginia. We're different parties, but this is one issue that we agree virtually right down the line on. I want to thank him for his leadership in this area as well. And thank all of you for being here. And as most of you know, the Atlantic Council has had a real and positive impact on foreign affairs over the years. And as I say, I'm very honored to be here for a few minutes to discuss Crimea and the situation there, which has been just disastrous in recent years. I would argue that in the last number of years, America's traditional leadership role around the world has oftentimes been lacking. There's been a power vacuum around various parts of the globe, one that Vladimir Putin and other bad actors have taken advantage of. And Russia's annexation of Crimea in early 2014 is a particularly egregious example of that power vacuum. I would argue that in the Middle East, when the United States, especially in Iraq, relatively unexpectedly removed all our forces from Iraq, we saw a power vacuum there that was ultimately filled by ISIS, and we've seen the bloody results of that in the South China Sea. We've seen China building islands and then remilitarizing or militarizing those islands for the first time there. So these power vacuums have happened in various parts of the globe, and that's particularly the case in Crimea and in much of Eastern Europe, unfortunately. Of course, this is not the first time that Russia has aggressively bullied its neighbors. We saw this in 2008 during the Georgia. And just last year, we saw meddling in Nagorno-Karabakh, again by Russia. But nothing in recent years has been as brazen as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's really pathetic that it's gone largely unrebuked by much of the world. Just yesterday, Russia sent 3 airborne divisions to Crimea in a drill that will involve 2,500 paratroopers and 600 pieces of military equipment being deployed on the peninsula. Russia plans to practice amphibious landings and carry out firing drills during, quote, offensive and defensive operations. The fact that Russia has successfully claimed another country's sovereign territory as its own and then carries out unprecedented offensive military drills there is absolutely outrageous and unacceptable. It should be unacceptable to all of the world. Meanwhile, our NATO allies condemn the actions taken by Russia and assert that they were not informed of the exercise and confirm that this action is in fact illegal, yet they do nothing. We do virtually nothing. The West stands idly by. My colleague, Mr. Connolly, and I have both heard testimony in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We've both been on there for quite a few years. I've been on there for 20 plus years now. We've heard testimony that indicated Russian aggression in Ukraine is not only an immediate threat to the security of NATO members, but also a telltale sign of what Russian aggression might look like in the not-too-distant future against other neighbors in the region. And that's why those other neighbors are so concerned. And I've seen that concern in Estonia and in Latvia and in Lithuania and in Poland and other parts of the region. And I think that concern, that fear that many of them have is not unwarranted. And the world needs to understand this and take appropriate action, or I think you could see that entire region blow up into a conflagration that we haven't seen in a long time. We have to avoid that at all costs. We have to get very serious about that. If we want to reestablish stability and peace in Ukraine, we must ensure that the people of Ukraine have the freedom to choose their own representatives in free and fair elections without coercion from Vladimir Putin. And I believe that America has a moral duty to support the Ukrainians in those efforts. And let me be clear. Let me say this very clearly to whoever may be listening at whatever branch of the government or anywhere else in Washington or elsewhere. Not only should sanctions against Russia not be lifted, they should be tightened. I want to reassure everyone in this room that both Mr. Connolly and I have made it abundantly clear that we are committed to confronting Putin's bullying tactics, and we will continue to stand firm on this issue, not only for the security and stability of our NATO partners and allies in the region, but for the safety and security of the American people. That is also why I'm very pleased to work with my friend and colleague, Mr. Connolly, to reintroduce H.R. 463, the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, in an effort to deny Russia de facto sovereignty over Crimea. We must never accept this. One should not be able to change one's borders, particularly in these so-called modern times, without there being a very high cost and without that being reversed. And I'm very dissatisfied with not only U.S. reaction and our NATO allies' reaction, but the rest of the world's reaction to date in basically accepting what Russia has done in this dangerous and illegal action with respect to Crimea. And again, I want to congratulate and thank my colleague, Mr. Connolly, for working across party lines. We've done that on other issues as well, but this is one where we stand together, and I would encourage the rest of our colleagues to do the same. And I would now like to, I already said I was going to say some nice things about Mr. Connolly. I guess I already did. But he is truly a great American. I've referred to him as the gentleman from the state of Virginia, and he has corrected me, and that it's actually the Commonwealth of Virginia on more than one occasion, and Virginia is one of those states that not quite as near and dear to me as my state of Ohio, but pretty near and dear because I was educated at the College of William and Mary, and it's a great institution. And my wife and I go back there periodically because we were married after my second year there, and she moved there, and so we have very fond memories. We've been married 43 years now. So, but in any event, I'd now like to recognize and welcome Mr. Connolly up here to make some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and let me praise my friend from Ohio. After a very puzzling national campaign in which the winner had made statements about Russia, and about Vladimir Putin, and about NATO, and about the EU, I was concerned about losing momentum on the Crimea Annexation Non-Recognition Act, and more importantly, U.S. policy. And as soon as we indicated to Steve we wanted to reintroduce the bill, would he sponsor it again, he said yes. It was a very powerful statement coming from the Republican side of the House. So Steve, thank you for doing that, and for reminding everyone we are a separate but co-equal branch of government up here, including when we want to address important compelling foreign policy issues. I certainly agree with everything Steve said, but my view about this is it all must start with Crimea. If you nod your head in acquiescence to the illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea, then you have no standing to quibble about Eastern Ukraine. For that matter, you have no standing to quibble about Georgia. And as we speak, Russia is making moves to annex parts of Georgia that it has been occupying since 2008. And so it has to start with Crimea. We won't recognize it. It is illegal. And as long as it takes, we will resist. And we will ask our allies to stand with us in that resistance. And, Steve and I are going to do it in every vehicle we have legislatively. We were successful in getting our language incorporated into the National Defense Authorization Act last year. And we're going to try to do it again. I head up the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and we have beaten back watering down language on the subject at every turn, 100%. And of course, the Baltics and Eastern European countries have been our staunch allies. I think it's important to remember, going back to the Stimson Doctrine in 1932, the United States, in what seemed a quixotic effort, refused to recognize Soviet annexation and incorporation of the Baltic republics. I can remember when I first moved to Washington in 1972, seeing, embassies for those countries in Washington. I thought, what is that? I mean, really? Well, today they are independent republics and members of NATO. It took a while, but our staunch insistence on their independence paid off. It mattered. And eventually it provided support for the legal basis for their independence. In the case of Crimea, there can be no doubt it is part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And there are some apologists for Putin and Russia up here, not many, thank God, but some, who make the case, well, come on, they want to be part of Russia, they had a vote, it was a dicey business, whether, at the time of Ukrainian independence, after the wall fell, that whether Crimea should have been involved. The Russians have strategic, interest in the Crimea, on the Black Sea and so forth. Well, that's all fascinating, and if we're going to reopen history, I mean, some of them would cite, the Stalin era, the post-Stalin era. Well, I'm Irish. There's a lot of history we'd like to revisit. With respect to territory and British illegal settlement of the North to make it, you know, a Protestant stronghold and so forth. I mean, there's lots of history we can reopen, including boundaries all over the world. In the 21st century in Europe, we must recognize and respect the boundaries that are. And frankly, putting any faith at this point in a referendum, given what the Russians are doing and have done, I think it's dubious business. You know, Ukraine has a right to seek its own future, and it seems to me the United States has to be the essential partner in that enterprise, no matter how unwelcome that may be in Moscow. Moscow has to understand the right of sovereign nations to their own autonomy, their own independence, and their own futures, even if they're neighboring countries. And so I will say, Steve talked about a power vacuum. The climate's gotten more complex and more difficult. One of the last things President Obama's administration did was to extend the sanctions. And one of the first things the Trump administration did was to reaffirm their support for those sanctions with respect to Crimea. And that was a very welcome message in an otherwise cloudy and not necessarily welcome set of foreign policy pronouncements with respect to our relationship with Russia, and of course, Russian behavior in our recent election. So at least on this one at the moment, we actually have some welcome, if not unexpected, clarity covering two administrations that have very different points of view about going forward with respect to the Russian relationship. I think it's very important, and I know my friend Steve Shabbat shares this view, however all of that's going to evolve, we here in Congress can make our contribution by speaking with great clarity, and in a sense with simplicity. We will not agree, ever. We will not wink and blink. We will not acquiesce on Crimea. And we will do everything in our part to keep tough sanctions, and as Steve said, maybe even reinforce those sanctions until the Russians relent, until they respect the sovereignty, the full sovereignty of the Ukraine. And I think it is important to remember, too, this is not an academic subject. This isn't, some long ago quibbling over borders and ethnicities. People have lost their lives over this. People, as we speak, are losing their lives in the eastern Ukraine. It's very serious business. And so I want to thank you for having this gathering today on the 30th anniversary. I hadn't focused earlier that the Russians, it's bad enough what they've done, but they did it the day after St. Patrick's Day. Terrible. So anyway, we're going to be stalwarts. Steve and I are going to work both sides of the aisles to make sure that our voices are clarion, and I hope and a very important part of U.S. foreign policy, speaking with one voice going forward. Thank you so much for having us here today. Good luck in your deliberations. God bless you.
Since Jerry made so much about the Irish issue, I should make publicly everybody aware that I'm half Irish myself.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you so much. Give us bad in front of the wheel. I got 14 events today. I know.
You're all welcome to come up in the front row. Come on up. There's 5 seats in the front row. Feel free to come on up, please. We've got 2 more seats. Come on up. Don't be shy.
Good morning, my name is Melinda Herring. I'm the editor of the Ukraine Alert blog at the Atlantic Council, and we're so pleased to have so many of you here with us. Thank you. And we have 4 distinguished panelists with us here this morning to talk about Crimea 3 years after annexation. Let me start to my far left with Dr. Anders Åslund, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and probably the top expert on economies in the former Soviet Union. Next to him is Dr. Mike Carpenter, who is now the Senior Director at the Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Next is Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, who is at the Brookings Institution, and he's a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. And finally, Dr. Bobby Herman, he's a Vice President of International Programs at Freedom House. So I want to start broadly with Bobby and Anders. Can you tell us 3 years after annexation, what is life like in Crimea? Just give us a broad picture of what we're looking at, please.
Thank you, Melinda, and it is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Atlantic Council. And it's a little daunting to be here with all these bona fide Ukraine experts, both on the panel and in the audience. In Freedom House, I think some of you may know, has chronicled really what's been going on, not just in all of Ukraine, of course, but also in Crimea through our publications, which some of you may be familiar with, and I want to touch a little bit on some of our findings. The short answer to your question is not good. And in fact, what we're seeing is that it's really in some ways the replication in miniature of the political system that has been erected by Vladimir Putin in Russia. So let me just tick off some of the fundamentals that they're seeing that really characterize the situation on the ground in Crimea 3 years afterwards. One, certainly the absence of accountable governance really across the spectrum, and that includes elections to the extent that they exist. They're sham elections. There is really no, that has meant that there is a dearth of political pluralism. We also see a judicial system that has been completely subordinated to executive authority. We see the near complete elimination of independent media, which was mentioned in the opening comments. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but really almost a complete dismantling of what had been a quite vibrant press and media outlets, and including now extending to the online space. Seeing the absence of political pluralism, it's really only those political parties and elsewhere that are supportive of the annexation are essentially allowed to operate. And we've got the systematic violation of what I call fundamental human rights. Let me just focus on 3 to mention them, and these really correspond to the areas that Freedom House works primarily on. One is freedom of expression, again, we think about media, but also freedom of association and freedom of assembly. All of them, for reasons, have come under threat. Having neutralized sort of any formal political opposition, it's not a surprise that the authorities, the occupation authorities, have gone after those that are seen as the biggest threat, which is civil society and also journalists. It's not a surprise that there's been a large exodus of journalists from Crimea, some of them continuing to try to operate from offshore. And then on civil society, restrictive legislation, which really Moscow really pioneered and had to global effect as we're starting the exporting of worst practices when it comes to civil society. So that means restrictive legislation in terms of the ability of folks to organize effectively, and also importantly to receive funding from abroad. Both of those and other restrictions are in place in Crimea. So let me stop there. We'll also, I know, talk a little bit about religious minorities who in some ways have borne the brunt of this repression, particularly the Tatars that was mentioned earlier, so we'll come back to that.
Thank you, Melinda. I have been quite a few times to Crimea. I went there the first time in 1986. Then it was a bustling Soviet holiday paradise. And then I visited Crimea every summer from 2006 to 2013, but I haven't been there since then. What Crimea is essentially a holiday resort. And then it's also a military base and a little bit of agriculture. That's what Crimea is economically. And how to describe it today is quite obvious. It's depressed. Depressed in every regard. And you have several reasons for it. The sanctions have been very effective. You can even see that Russian big state companies do not want to operate in Crimea. Instead of one of the big state banks, you have a specially set up state bank for managing Crimea, so that it won't suffer from other sanctions. And we are seeing that exports and imports, all foreign trade, has fallen by almost 90% because of these very effective sanctions. The Ukrainians have gradually caught up in their economic policy towards Crimea. To begin with, there was a lot of trade, but in November 2015, some activists blew up electricity supply to Crimea, and since then, virtually all trade and supplies from Ukraine have been cut off. And that is railways, it's electricity, it's water. 85% of the water in Crimea came from the Great Crimean Canal, which is now essentially stopped. Instead, the Russians are coming in with state companies and state subsidies. The state subsidies, the first year were very substantial, $4 or $5 billion. Now they are $1.5 to $2 billion a year. So what does this mean to the economy? There's very little real economy. The tourism has fallen from 6 million a year to 3 million the first year after occupation, and then it has recovered to 4.2, probably almost to 5 million tourists last year, but it's depressed. Previously, 2/3 of the tourists were Ukrainians, now 95% are Russians. So it has become a patriotic duty to go to Crimea, and also you have very many Russians who are not allowed to travel abroad. Essentially everybody working in any kind of security or police service in Russia. So who is happy and who is unhappy economically? You can say that the pensioners are happy to get higher Russian pensions. The state employees, who are very many, are happy to get higher Russian salaries. The young are to a considerable extent leaving, because this is very much a sanction area in which you will not be. So what is the lifeline economically? Only Russian subsidies, nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Mike and Steve, can you tell us a little bit about the implications of Russian militarization of Crimea? After annexation, there's been a number of troops moved in and weaponry as well. Can you tell us about the implications of what that means?
Sure. To pick up on first on Anders' comment that it was a Soviet paradise, there's one element of continuity there. It's probably the most Soviet region in the entire world right now, in terms of human rights, in terms of development, in terms of ideology, and various other factors. But in terms of militarization, what we've seen is, of course, a massive buildup of military infrastructure in what was previously a very militarized region to begin with. So together with Kaliningrad and the Moscow region, Crimea is one of the most militarized parts of the entire space where Russia deploys military forces. Of course, the Donbass being another area where Russia deploys significant forces. But in Crimea, they've invested in the infrastructure as well. And so a lot is talked about anti-access area denial capabilities. And it's true, Russia has really built up significant anti-access area denial systems in Crimea. These include bastion coastal defense systems, in other words, anti-ship cruise missile systems, very sophisticated air defense systems, the most modern of these being the S-400. They have new airfields in Belbek, for example, have deployed warfare. They are exercising with significantly increased op tempo. So, for example, the Kafkaz 2016 exercise last year was essentially a simulated defense of the Crimean Peninsula from an amphibious attack, an airborne attack. So a lot of new systems being put in. There are, of course, dual capable, nuclear capable delivery systems on the peninsula as well. We don't know whether there's nuclear weapons there right now or not, but it is a highly, highly militarized region. What that means for U.S. policy going forward is obviously there is no military counter to what that will enable Ukraine to regain control of the peninsula, given the sheer number of assets and the strength of those assets on the peninsula. But that does not mean that there is not any military action that both the United States and NATO should be contemplating. In fact, we should be contemplating some military action. It includes standing up a greater maritime posture in the Black Sea to counter the offensive capabilities. And by the way, in terms of offensive capabilities, I didn't mention as well short-range ballistic missiles and potentially medium-range ballistic missiles as well that could be launched from the peninsula. And if you look at the range of those systems, they come into NATO territory, both in Romania, Bulgaria, but also in other parts of Europe. So there are military posture decisions that need to be made in light of what's happening there, but then there's also a host of other issues and policies that should be discussed that I think we'll get into later in terms of maintaining that non-recognition policy.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what Mike said about you've seen over the last 2 years a fairly substantial militarization of Crimea, and basically a restoration of some of the capabilities that were there in Soviet times when Crimea really was the hub for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, Soviet Black Sea Fleet, and also their fleets out in the Mediterranean and air power. I also think that it is important that NATO take certain responsive steps. Some of those steps have been taken, and depending on what the Russians do in Crimea, additional steps may be necessary. I guess I would draw some distinctions in terms of what to worry about. I mean, the Russian naval presence, I think, is going to grow in Crimea simply because Sevastopol is by far the best harbor in the Black Sea. But we also have to, Russian ships at Sevastopol face the same problem as do Russian ships at base at Novorossiysk, because they still have to get out through the Turkish Straits. So I think strategically, that's an issue that it doesn't have a big strategic impact. Likewise, I think we will see more Russian air power going to Crimea. But again, I think Russian air power based in Crimea actually also is more vulnerable than Russian air power that's actually based back in the interior of Russia. And while the Russians are moving to do anti-access aerial denial systems around Crimea as they are in Kaliningrad, we have to be concerned about that, but I think it's also true that if you look at the U.S. military, what they've been doing over the last 10 years in terms of F-22s, F-35s, joint air-to-surface strike missiles, the U.S. has been investing in substantial capabilities, basically designed to take down A2AD systems. The one area where I think is of concern, which Mike alluded to, is whether you see, for example, the deployment of the Iskandar, a short-range ballistic missile system to Crimea. Throughout Russia and the Russian military, you've seen over the last several years Iskandar basically replacing the SS-21. So, for example, it's my expectation that it's only a matter of time before you see Iskandars deployed full-time in Kaliningrad. I don't believe the Soviets, the Russians, ever put SS-21s into Crimea because they really couldn't reach anything. The Iskandar, on the other hand, has the range now to be able, from Crimea to hold targets at risk in Romania. And one thing politically that would be important to the Russians would be able to say we can now reach the American missile defense site in Romania with Iskandar. So my own guess is it's only a matter of time before you see Iskandar on the Crimean Peninsula. About 2 years ago, a suggestion was made by a Russian Ministry of Defense official that it was only a matter of time. I think you'll see that, and that then will open the question, because the Iskandar is a dual-capable system. It can be deployed with a nuclear weapon as well as with a conventional warhead. Does the Iskandar mean that nuclear weapons have been returned to the Crimean Peninsula? And there's little doubt that the Soviets maintain a nuclear weapons establishment there, primarily to support the Black Sea Fleet. But do you see that now returning as delivery systems go back into Crimea?
Thanks, Steve. I want to ask a question to all four of you panelists. what can be done to return ownership of the peninsula to Ukraine, and what kind of time frame are we looking at? So, Anders, if you could talk a little bit more about sanctions, anything else you have in mind? Gentlemen, if you could talk about defense and any kind of human rights mechanisms.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on that. Of course, anybody who gets involved in Crimea gets sanctioned. And a wonderful example here is the building of a bridge carriage. President Putin has three great friends, three good cronies. Gennady Timchenko is the richest. He refused to build the bridge over the Strait of Kerch and seems to have lost out with Putin somewhat after that. So Arkady Rotenberg, and now Putin's old great friend from St. Petersburg, they did judo together in their youth. So you must appreciate such a man. He was then given the contract of $4.5 billion. What does the US do? Sanction all the companies that are in any way involved in the production of this bridge. Also lots of subsidiaries. Take the brother and take the son just in case, because they're also involved in this. This is sanction maintenance. So I think that what Congressman Connolly said here, treat them as the Baltic states, keep them isolated, and in due time it will come, but this is not the trigger.
So my view is that you need to start with increased pressure on Russia to get the Donbass back to Ukrainian sovereign control. You maintain sanctions on Crimea, potentially you increase sanctions on Crimea, but really the focus in the near term should be on Donbass, which is not to say that we forget about Crimea, and I think that's where Congressman Connolly was very strong in his initial presentation, and I agree with him. We should not forget about Crimea. We should seek to pursue the policy of non-recognition that we've already begun, but we should strengthen it through various legal means, and as I said earlier, by changing potentially NATO force posture in the Black Sea region. So we should make this a region that is indigestible for Russia going forward. But in terms of the diplomacy, and in terms of the immediate impact of a sanctions incentive structure, if you will, I think the focus should be on Donbass, which means that returning Crimea to Ukraine is a long-term proposition. Given everything I said at the outset about how militarized the peninsula is, what types of military assets Russia has deployed there, obviously there is no military solution here, but the pressure needs to be steady. And as I said, once we've made progress on Donbass, which is going to be hard enough as it is, and is going to take significantly increased pressure from the United States and the European Union to get Russia to back off, because remember, for Russia, this is absolutely existential. This is a core, seeking control over the government in Kiev is a core national interest for the Kremlin, and they will not back off until they feel that there is additional pressure and significant, substantial additional pressure brought to bear on it. So my view is this is a long-term issue that needs to be solved with that perspective in mind, but that is not to say you hive it off, you forget about it for now, and you don't do anything in this space. On the contrary, you do prosecute companies that seek to violate sanctions or go around it, and we've had a number of cases already with some, I won't go into specifics, but some Western European companies that have wanted to do business in Crimea and that have sought workaround measures to do that business. We need to be very vigilant and prevent this from happening and continue, as I said, to make Crimea indigestible. If I could just do one little additional comment here, which is I take a little bit of issue with what Steve said. Of course, we agree on almost everything usually when we're on panels, but one issue which I disagree with a little bit is in terms of the strategic significance of the Black Sea Fleet and in terms of the air power that Russia has in Crimea. I mean, you mentioned ranging missile defense sites potentially in Romania, which is a concern, but with a more capable Black Sea Fleet, Russia poses a tremendous threat to Turkey, to our NATO ally Turkey, as well as to Romania, Bulgaria, and then our partners in Georgia. And this is important because right now, of course, Russia and Turkey have a rapprochement that is going on for the last 6 months or so. But let's not forget that, in late 2015, early 2016, Russia was essentially hunting for Turkish military assets that strayed over the border into Syria, and it had demonstrated its willingness to take them down. And so that relationship can flip back and forth. And for us, having a NATO ally that is so vulnerable on the southern side of the Black Sea is not something that we should take lightly. We need to invest the resources to be able to counter that down the road.
Mike, let me just point, I don't think actually, we don't disagree on that point. Yeah, and I think actually NATO should be responding to do things that would be supportive of Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. But what I am saying is that, whether there are Russian Navy ships at Crimea or in North East, if it's going to be a threat beyond the Black Sea, they still have to go through the Turkish Straits, and that's an issue that NATO can control. Let me also agree with your point. I think the Donbass has to be the priority both for the Ukrainians in the West right now, because it's in Donbass where people are dying every week. And it doesn't mean we forget about Crimea, but I mean, trying to stabilize, find a settlement that ends the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian conflict in Donbass has to be the priority. In terms of the return of Crimea, analytically, it's very hard for me to see how Ukraine must use the leverage to bring Crimea back under Ukrainian sovereignty. There is no military option for the Ukrainians. It's just not going to happen. Economic sanctions, as Anders describes, I think can make holding onto Crimea painful for the Russians, and it can drive up the costs. But I don't see the cost reaching the point economically where Vladimir Putin reverses course. And I think the realistic prospect is Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin until 2026. So I don't see that changing. And the one scenario in which I think Ukraine could in the longer term succeed would be if that Ukraine built an economy that was so successful that the people of Crimea concluded that their economic lot might be better as part of Ukraine with Russia. Because I do believe that 3 years ago, had you had a real referendum in Crimea, not the bogus referendum that we saw the Russians run, but had there been a real referendum, my guess is a significant portion of the population would have voted for association with Russia, because they concluded that time, perhaps incorrectly, that their economic circumstances would be better with Russia. If Ukraine can reduce that equation, you might see the population in Crimea saying, wait a minute, it's better to go back to where we were. Now that's the analytical judgment. On the policy judgment, there's no how and no way that the United States should recognize the illegal incorporation of Crimea into Russia. We know how to do non-recognition policy. We did it for 5 decades with the Baltic states, and we simply continue that policy. We sanction companies that do business there. Those people in Crimea who wish to travel need to go with a Ukrainian passport to Kyiv, not to the embassy to Moscow. We can continue to impose certain prices there and make the political point that the United States and the Western world does not accept what the Russians have done by military force. And I guess I would maybe slightly contradict myself in the sense that, well, I think Donbass is more of a priority now in terms of saving lives. Actually, it's Crimea which is probably the more important for the principle of the European security building. If you go back to the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, the cardinal principle of that act was states should not use military force to change boundaries or take territories. And in that sense, Crimea actually is worse than what's going on in Donbass.
Let me just echo a couple of things that were said in terms of, one, keeping in place the sanctions, also the non-recognition regime, absolutely. As you said, we've got a lot of experience in that sphere going back many years, having recently come back from Lithuania. I was reminded of that and talking to folks there. And also something that I think is very much overlooked, which I absolutely would agree as well, that making Ukraine a model, not just of socioeconomic progress, but of democracy, and getting a handle on, I know you've spoken very eloquently about this, about corruption and the rest, so making it a place that people want to stay, and where Anders had talked about the fleeing that's happening in Crimea, especially of young people. Let me add one other dimension, which is to say that elevating what's going on the ground. We talked a little bit about a black hole in terms of information black hole. So there's not really a lot of understanding about the nature in Crimea for the moment in terms of, again, systematic violation of human rights really across the full spectrum and what that meant for religious minorities, Tatars and others. that what's happening there is not getting out. So there's very little discussion of this in international or it's a multilateral fora, whether that's the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the UN General Assembly, OSCE. All these bodies are interested. One of the recommendations that we would certainly make and have made is trying everything we can to get an international human rights monitoring presence on the ground, one that's robust. Also finding a way that local voices can do their work. It's virtually impossible. I mean, there are some very courageous people who are really putting their lives on the line to do that kind of work, to report on what's happening, to monitor, get that word out so that the world knows, again, the systematic repression that we're seeing really across the board. And to the extent that the U.S. and European others can get something like a presence on the ground so we can, again, know the fuller story about what's happening, that would be, I think, another step, thinking over the long term of how maybe the strategy for having Crimea come back to Ukraine.
So Bobby is our human rights expert here, and let's go a little bit deeper on some of these human rights issues, Bobby. Let's talk a little bit more about independent media. Is there any independent media there? I know I personally look to a website called Free Crimea. It's a fantastic website. It's in English and Russian, Free Crimea, and they work with courageous Crimean journalists, many of whom have moved to Kiev. It's a very good source of information, but like you said, Crimea doesn't make the headlines anymore. Ukraine doesn't really make the headlines. You know, and if it does, it's the conflict or corruption. So I really appreciate that point. But also I wanted to bring up the case. There's a RVRL journalist who is facing trial right now for an opinion piece he wrote for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And I think he could go, if he's convicted, he could go to jail for about 6 years. He's 66 years old. His name is Mykola Semenina. And there's many, many cases of these people who've spoken out, of people who've made films that are contrary to the regime. Tell us a little bit about independent media and where people get their news.
Those are important questions. Let me give numbers, don't tell the full story, but this is one that come from one of our reports, that as of before the annexation, there were some 3,000 outlets, media outlets, approximately, in Crimea. By less than 2 years later, that number had gone to 232 outlets that were registered. So it'll give you a sense of the decimation, really the complete evisceration of that segment of a real bulwark. If you're going to have democratic progress, you need to have an independent press. We don't need to explain that to anybody here in the room. But again, they have been absolutely a target of maybe the principal target of the authorities, the occupying authorities, and with good reason, right? They don't want word to get out about what's happening. The systematic, not just the violation, but also the intimidation, harassment, day-to-day patterns, and sometimes more egregious cases of people being abducted, disappeared. I mean, we're seeing that as well. And as we know, this also has a profound chilling effect. So while there are absolutely courageous people who are continuing to be on the ground, not just those who have fled and try to continue their work from, we would say, offshore, sometimes in Kiev or even further afield, that the self-censoring that's happening for those who have remained is intense. And they are coming under, again, harassment, pressure. We're seeing destruction of equipment, all sorts of things that, in one way or the other, are designed to make sure that there is no reporting on what's happening in the country.
There's even been cases, too, of journalists who lived in Crimea, they moved to Kiev, and then there was harassment of their parents.
Yes.
I mean, it's getting to be outrageous.
That's right. I mean, again, that's an effort to censor and have people self-censor, that if they're continuing to do their reporting from offshore, that their families still may come under threat. And local, again, the decimation of local media, but at the same time also it's been almost impossible for foreign media to get in. So you think they might have a little bit more latitude, but the fact of the matter is they likewise cannot report. So this is the state, again, a pretty dismal state. It didn't happen by accident. This is perfectly by design. Certainly you're also not going to get anybody who's talking about the corruption and other things that are happening. And all of this, one of the things this is not unique to Crimea or even to Russia, but it's the cynical manipulation of the judiciary. So to put the passing restrictive legislation about what journalists and others can do, it's meant to provide a patina of legitimacy to what is really just an effort to quash dissent, full stop. But by the idea of putting in pieces legislation and also using the canard of that this is that there's radical extremism that's used not so much with journalists but much more with ethnic minorities, especially the Tatars. Again, part of a larger effort to completely eliminate any dissenting voices.
Please.
Let me add, there's one thing that I find very interesting about Crimea is that, the population of Crimea for 20 years actually grew up under the Ukrainian political system, which was much more open, much more tolerant of, dissent than the system in Russia. And I think Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev found this out about 18 months ago when he went to Crimea and was basically chased away by an audience of ethnic Russians who wanted to be part of Russia. They're basically saying, where are our pensions, what about prices, things like that. And so you see there's a willingness to challenge authority in Crimea on the part of, not just the Tatars and Ukrainians, but also ethnic Russians that you don't usually see in Russia. Now, I don't know how you sustain that, but that may be something that we ought to look at in terms of how do you keep that alive, because you hate to see it develop to the point where it is in Russia, where you don't see that willingness to challenge authority.
Well, Steve, if I could just pick up on your point, I think this gets to your earlier thesis about making Ukraine more attractive to population in Crimea than Russia. And some polling that was done in 2014 is actually kind of instructive, done in the Donbass, but I think it applies to Crimea as well. And you saw in that polling that regardless of ethnicity, whether ethnic Ukrainian or ethnic Russian, the segment of the polling sample that was advocating for joining Russia in some way, shape, or form were folks that in focus groups revealed that it was because they thought that in Russia there would be a higher standard of living and less corruption than where they were currently living. Now, if you flip that, and there is some anecdotal evidence that whether you be ethnic Ukrainian or ethnic Russian in Crimea, if you believe that Ukraine is less corrupt, you have better standard of living, you have more opportunities, especially for your kids, but also for yourself, then that flips the equation, and potentially you start to build a population that is more receptive to going back to Ukraine. So I think that's actually very important.
I think those are excellent points. Let's talk a little bit more about Crimea. Was unique and very different. It had a large Crimean Tatar population before annexation. It had a large ethnic Ukrainian population as well. Bobby, can you tell us how many people have left? Where did they go? And what's it like for those who stayed behind? What's it like for people to be religious minorities in Crimea today?
Well, again, this sounds like a repeat. Ditto from what was said before about this is very, very difficult.
Sorry, you have to be the downer today.
Yeah, that's all right. So I'm generally quite upbeat, as people know, as I look around the world and what's happening in terms of the authoritarian assault on democracy, human rights, and human rights activists, but always try to remind myself that that's happening precisely because civil society has never been stronger, has never been posed more of a threat, with formal political parties having been sort of neutralized. It's really civil society, it's really the citizenry that is seen as the biggest threat to authoritarian power. In the case of the Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians, the numbers, unfortunately, are not very good. Very good in terms of, we don't know how reliable are. Seeing approximately 27,000 Crimean residents are now residing elsewhere. And that includes both the Tatars and as well as the other ethnic Ukrainians. And so this is, by most accounts, this is a way underestimates. And these, I should mention, this data comes from, this is the official data provided by the Ukrainian government. Most knowledgeable observers think that number is twice or even 3 times higher, to give you some indication. Where are they going? I mean, you and I had a conversation a couple of days ago, and you pointed out to me that some of them are going to strange places like Western Ukraine and the rest. Kyiv, obviously, I think is still the hub where most of them go, but I'm sure that they are spreading, and some of them are also not staying in Ukraine. So, and there's no really reliable tracking that I've seen of that data. So that's part of the problem. We don't really have a full grasp of the scope. And I think, again, Anders' point before about young people leaving in Georgia and journalists and others who can't continue to function there. In general, life for ethnic minorities, it's again a bit of a repeating story that we've heard. The repression that we're seeing generally across the population, I would say, is even more intense, especially on the Crimean Tatars. And how ironic is that after decades of struggle to reclaim their rights and their voice and their identity, now they find themselves, perhaps not surprisingly, really in the lead in terms of the opposition to the annexation. And as a consequence, they've come under much more pressure, much more threat. So mosques are heavily monitored. We know that there, again, I alluded to before, the use of the threat of extremism and terrorists, seeing that as the reason to be able to really suppress religious freedom and expression of faith, not just in the Crimean Tatar community that's more broad, but again, they've come under, I think, for the brunt of this. Their leaders are subject to, again, ongoing pattern of harassment, intimidation. There was one case where one of the leaders, the Crimean Tatar leaders, was, I believe, was addressing, I think it was the Parliamentary Assembly of the in Europe, and came back and was arrested. Wasn't detained for a long time, but this is part of the mentality. They want to say that everybody is always under threat. Everybody is always being watched, heavy hand of the state. There's also, this connects also to broader Russification that's taking place in the peninsula, making it harder for Ukrainian language, Crimean Tatar language. We saw the closing down, also I should mention, of the Tatars' representative body, the Majlis. So all of these are ways of making life, if not intolerable, very, very difficult for those who, again, people of faith across the different faith communities, not just the Crimean Tatars, although, again, they've come under the greatest stress.
Absolutely, the Ukrainian patriarch has come under tremendous stress. Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptist communities, anyone who's not part of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I just wanted to make a point. Paul Gopal is excellent on this issue and has followed the data very carefully. He has a wonderful blog called Window on Eurasia, and I highly recommend that if you're interested in looking a little bit more in more depth at this issue. Mike, I also wanted to say, you made an interesting point that the Russians could push it too far. They could try to make people. Maybe the Crimean community isn't ready to be fully Russian. I saw news that on the 3rd anniversary of the Crimean annexation, they were being told, they're being spoon-fed slogans. These are the things we expect you to say on the streets. And let's hope that people aren't ready for that.
Well, I know Anders had something to say, so I'm going to yield the floor a second. But just on this point, I think it's important for a lot of folks here in this room probably know this already, but a lot of the Russian sort of elite presence, the business interests in Crimea that are tied to the Kremlin and tied to shady actors like Konstantin Malafeyev, who has bankrolled a lot of Russia's operation in the Donbass. This is essentially an organized crime racket. I mean, look at the types of businesses that they control. It's casinos, it's hotels, but it's very much a mafioso state that you see evolving in Crimea. And so, was this the case in the past? Yeah, but it was probably a little bit more in the shadows. I mean, it's not as if it just came out of nowhere. And so if you project this over time, a decade from now, or maybe 15, 20 years from now, you could see this little mafia-like entity existing in Crimea, which is in fact even more corrupt and more dangerous than neighboring regions in Russia proper. And Ukraine looking a lot more, a democratic, prosperous Ukraine that fights corruption, looking a lot more attractive to the population there. But I'm just going to
Okay, before you up on my point here, when I was last in Crimea back in September 2013, I was at a big conference. And at big conference, it was with a round table, somebody came and sat down beside me, so we exchanged a business card, and it turned out to be the chairman of Crimean Parliament, Vladimir Konstantinov. So my wife was rather sensitive. She saw the people he came with and said, "I'm not going to sit with these bandits," and marched off, which was of course the right sensitivity. And later on I learned that this Vladimir Konstantinov was still there as chairman of the parliament. He happened to have a bank debt to Ukraine of $100 million. We said them if you are sufficiently important. So he, by taking Crimea out of Ukraine, he managed to get rid of a debt of $100 million, which was of course entirely because of his political convictions. I'm not trying to suggest anything else. But what I wanted to, with regard to what Bobby said, I wanted to provide a bit of a perspective how much worse it is in Donbass than in Crimea. So we should remember that Crimea, the last I saw 5 people killed, perhaps twice that. It's a small number. And dozens of people who have been abducted or something like that. In a few tens of thousands of people have left. They claim that 20,000 nice pensioners from Russia have arrived, probably former military who like to live in Sevastopol and Yalta. And if we compare with Donbass, there were 4.5 to 5 million people in what is now occupied Donbass. 2 to 2.5 million people have left, half the population. 10,000 people have been killed only on the Ukrainian side. We have no idea how many people have been killed on the Russian side, probably about as many. The day before yesterday, 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed, and this is not news anywhere, because most days about 2 Ukrainian soldiers are being killed. So this is low intensity, but still hot war. And economically, Donbass has got very few resources from Russia. And until recently, completely discriminated against from Russian side. Until the 18th of February, high school or university degree in Donbass was not recognized, not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia. While Crimea is fully integrated, all papers are of Russian legal quality, and Crimea has got a lot of money. So Crimea is okay for a pensioner who's not politically interested and likes the sun and the sea and doesn't care more. Donbass is awful in every relevant regard and completely lawless, while Crimea is just heavily repressive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders. We'd love to bring the audience in now. Yes, Dr. Kuzov.
We've been discussing the issues of what kind of policies we should have. I have 2 suggestions. One, when we meet and when people like yourselves host Democrats from Russia or Democratic opposition, we should put them on the spot about Crimea. Because the majority of Russians, including so-called Democrats, support the annexation. And that's something they don't support the Donbass, but they do support the annexation of Crimea. So we should put them on the spot. I think Boris Nemtsov was one of the minority that didn't. But secondly, more importantly, this goes back to Ambassador Piper and Andrew Lansley's talk about sanctions. I think we should put the Ukrainians and the Europeans on the spot on sanctions. Because on the one hand, sanctions are doing very well, and but they're being undermined. They're being undermined first by the Ukrainians as well. So how can President Poroshenko demand the West continue sanctions when his cronies make money from selling because of Crimean activists, so that began to stop or slow down. So Ukraine should get real. But more importantly, particularly after this report came out yesterday, that Russia's been laundering billions of dollars through the West, and 20 billion plus, the figures talked about yesterday in the report. And that's going through British banks. Sorry, European banks. I'm being too sensitive to my own country. But to European banks. So the Europeans should get serious. And on one hand, they're imposing sanctions. On the other hand, they're saying, give us your dirty money.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, the latter point, I mean, this money laundering from the former Soviet Union is massive. And the organizations that, what are they called, international financial, I forget the name.
The report yesterday, organized crime and corruption.
Yeah, but that is another one. But the total outflow from Russia of cash is in the order of $700 billion. And accumulated for 25 years plus. And from Ukraine, they assess it at $120 billion. The Ukraine's GDP today is $90 billion. So these are massive amounts of money. And the main protectors of this is the United Kingdom and the US. Switzerland has completely given up this business. And then you have certain outposts like Cyprus, Malta, Latvia still, but it has been considerably cleaned up. It's really Anglo-Saxon law that you can have these trusts and anonymous companies. So this is a serious problem. So I think that the big demand that we should put is transparency.
Anders, what was the name of the law again?
I don't remember what they're called.
Well, the organized crime and corruption report.
OCCRP is one of them, but it's the International Financial Integrity or something like that. It's headed by Raymond Baker here in town.
Do you have any more questions? Yes, sir. And if you would identify yourself and please ask a question, that'd be great. And you're going to have to project. We don't have microphones.
It's fine. My name is Askell Krushelitsky. I'm a journalist. Despite the another great accent, I'm a proud Yank. My question is, Putin has deliberately, intimately associated himself with the occupation, annexation of Crimea. Is there a political solution that can be offered to him that's somehow commensurate with his political survival, and hence, actually, probably physical survival?
I don't see it. I mean, I think you made the point is Putin has really wrapped himself up in the return of Crimea. And you'll see this, I think, over the course of the next year in the run-up to the Russian presidential election. If you go back and you look at Putin's first two terms as president back in the early 2000s, regime legitimacy was based on economics. And Russians would say there's this implicit social contract where Putin says you're not going to have political authority, but you're going to see a growing economy, and he delivered. When he came back to the presidency in 2012, the economic situation was much bleaker. And so you see him talking about Russian nationalism. Russia is a great power, a very strong anti-American tinge. And when you look at the prospects looking at it, and the most optimistic thing someone will say about the Russian economy looking at the next 4 or 5 years is it will continue to stagnate, grow at maybe 1 to 1.5% per year. But that's not going to give them a basis to sort of justify his regime. So I think you're going to see continuation of what we saw, what was since 2012. And a big part of that narrative is, he brought Crimea back. And I don't see anything that you can do with Putin that would cause him to reverse course on that. That would be, I think, almost regime threatening to him.
Anders?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on your wonderful book about the Orange Revolution several years ago. Secondly, very much in line with what Steve said about it, even harder. I think that what we should expect from Putin is small, victorious wars. In the words of the Minister of Interior, Vyacheslav von Klever, in 1904. We saw a small victorious war in Georgia in 2008, Putin's highest approval rating ever, and then Crimea, 88% approval, even split the liberals, as Taras alluded to, and this gave him even a higher approval rating. I think that we should expect more small, victorious wars. The problem with Donbass was that it was neither victorious nor small. Syria might be a better war. So the question is, where will we see the next war? This is the very essence of the Putin regime, because The economy is not growing, the standard of living is not there. Putin emphasizes all kinds of stability, macroeconomic and political stability very strongly, but then it is essentially a fascist, expansionary ideology that is now embracing, that was, which comes clearly out of his embrace by the Russian fascist philosopher Ivan Ilyin. So we should expect worse rather than better. Thank you.
Okay, I have a very gloomy panel. Mike and Mike, and then Elena, and then the gentleman here.
I'm just going to agree with both gentlemen and tie the two threads together. I don't think there's a solution to Crimea in the Putinist era. I think it has to be post-Putinist. I say Putinist because not just Putin, but if Putin is succeeded by someone from his inner circle, letting go of Crimea will be devastating to the regime and to their survivability. So I don't think that is in the cards. But to get to your point, I think it behooves us nevertheless to continue to apply pressure on Crimea and on Russia, because if not, it will again fan the flames of Russian revanchism and lead to potentially small victorious wars in other parts of the Soviet, post-Soviet periphery. And we've just seen in the last week that Russia has announced it's merging its armed forces with those of South Ossetia. Now, of course, this has been in practice the case for more than 10 years. In fact, from before the invasion of Georgia in 2008. But what this means is that Russia is getting bolder and bolder in terms of taking steps to de facto annex now South Ossetia to Russia. And this is a half step. It's a step in the process. It's not definitive, but it is moving in that direction. And if you don't push back, then potentially this either happens in South Ossetia or in some other part of the Russian periphery that we haven't yet focused on.
Northern Kazakhstan or Belarus, or are those totally?
I don't think those are crazy scenarios. When I was at the State Department working on Georgia in 2008 during the war, at the time we were raising the alarm about Russian potential military activity in Crimea. And at the time it was dismissed as ridiculous. Well, okay. So it took a number of years. It didn't happen then in the fall of 2008. I don't think it's ridiculous that it could happen in northern Kazakhstan. I don't think it's ridiculous that it could happen in Belarus. In fact, I think the Russians have signaled very clearly to Lukashenko, if you don't take care of these current protests that are happening as a result of a very poorly thought through policy of taxing essentially payroll, then we'll take care of it for you. And I have no doubt that Russia would be happy to intervene more forcefully in Belarus if they felt that the regime was losing control of the situation, or if they simply wanted to assert greater control.
Great, thank you, Mike. Elena, and then the two gentlemen here. Go ahead.
So thank you everyone for joining us for this panel. We touched on this topic, I think you did, Bobby, but also something that you said, and Ambassador Pfeiffer, I think ties into it. This idea that Crimea is behind an information iron curtain, right? People have very little access to non-Russian state-sponsored media sources, which I think breeds an entire set of attitudes and ideas based on that information. And one of those, as we report on recently from the few Western journalists that go to Crimea, is the idea that, when you talk to people on the streets, they say, well, things may not be great, but at least we don't have a war here, right? And this is the perception that is constantly perpetuated by the Russian media. So I guess my question is, to the earlier point, Ambassador Pfeiffer, that Ukraine will have to develop economically as a way to change people's minds that maybe they want to go back to Ukraine from Crimea, maybe that's a better place for Crimea. I mean, how does that happen in this context of complete kind of information black hole, right? How can we, meaning the United States, Westerners, civil society, or policymakers, should we be engaged in trying to penetrate that Russian-speaking media environment to provide better information? There's some efforts going on already. Our PRL, for example, is doing a lot on this. But is there more that we can do? Because I don't see, a space in the long term, people changing their minds if they don't have good information about what's actually happening.
Thank you for that. I agree. There's no question it's going to be harder for people if they don't know what's happening even right outside their door. I mean, maybe one addendum to what I said before, which is that, yes, we use the word black hole or it's information, but the fact is that there is some information getting out. The question is how can you get that and expand it so that more people have access to it. Part of the problem has been the internet, which can be a good force in many instances. That's not the case here because we're seeing it disrupted. We're seeing also, I'm not, but folks tell me that on Facebook and Twitter that occasionally those things come in and out. But there is movement of some information. There's also people who are, again, on the ground who are reporting out what's happening, more about the human rights situation there. Now, could we get information in from what's happening in other places? That's, I think, tougher. I would say, maybe we haven't had too much in the way of optimistic news, but I think it goes back to the point that was made before about putting Russians on the spot. I mean, I can tell you that one of the things that when we, Freedom House and other organizations that are doing work on democracy and human rights generally, but when we have interactions with our Russian friends, that becomes a point that we talk about a lot. And the fact of the matter is, there are Russians, especially in the human rights space, who are deeply concerned about what's happening in Donbass and also in Crimea. That's a possibility. If they're able to travel and others go back, we may also see an ability to get that information out more broadly.
Yeah, I think cracking the Crimean information space now basically presents the same problem as getting into Russia. So we've got to think clear ways are there cyberways, internet, social media. The one advantage I think we may have though in Crimea is I think there's a population that, because of their experience in the Ukrainian political system, that still may be more receptive to that. That, as I said, Medvedev goes to Crimea and encounters a reaction unlike a reaction that will ever meet anywhere in Russia. The challenge is going to be finding a way to get into that information space to try to sustain that. And what I worry about is if we're not clever in creative ways, you may see that same more rigid political attitude take hold in Crimea that you've seen in Russia over the last 10 to 15 years.
Thanks. Okay, these two gentlemen here, let's take the questions together then, please.
I'm Bill Hederman, Senior Fellow at UPenn's Climate Energy Center, and until recently, Secretary of Energy Moniz had sent me in-country to Ukraine for fairly extensive time to help develop a path to less dependence on Russian gas and electricity. The Baltic states heard about this, and I was asked to go visit them as well. And my question goes at the issue of upping sanctions now versus holding some weapons in reserve. If you do everything now, can that trigger more Russian boldness because there's nothing else to lose? I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you. And the gentleman in front.
Yes, my name is Paul Thomas. I've been running several businesses in Ukraine for almost 25 years now. Because foreign policy is a long-term game, I would suggest that the strategic emphasis has to be placed on aggressive engagement with Ukraine. Look, Russian foreign policy hasn't changed in 500 years. Probe for weakness on your border. When you find it, exploit it. When you meet sufficient resistance, pause and start probing elsewhere. Ukraine is theoretically in its third reformist government, right? You went from Yushenko to Tennessee to Porsche. Still, there has been, and I can tell you this from very deep personal experience doing business there has been zero reform of the judicial and prosecutorial branch of the government. They remain under the total control of the Ukrainian president. I'm not suggesting anything ill-toward, but it does make a mockery of the separation of power. He has the power governmentally. That also creates a chaotic space around him, ironically, where it forces him to do deals with Firtash and Akhmetov and Penchuk in order to not only maintain his power, because he's basically holding it provisionally, not constitutionally, but then they do these deals which keeps the structure of power at the top today identical to what it was under Kuchma. And unless we somehow very aggressively engage them and break that, we won't do what you guys are mentioning, which is crucial. Make Ukraine the economic democratic success story
that'll win the game with Crimea, the Donbass, and all of Russia. Russia's terrified of Ukraine becoming a wealthy, stable, democratic country. Well, he doesn't have to lose any sleep. They're not.
Thank you so much.
So, there you go.
Thank you so much. Anders, go ahead.
Yeah, let me answer the second question. You're of course perfectly right. The big problem, I think, with Western policy towards Ukraine today is that there's far too little money on the table. Ukraine's total public debt at the end of 2013 was $73 billion. Now, 3 years later, after this massive Western aid, it's $71 billion. Ukraine has been paying back the outside world rather than getting net aid. And I'm seriously concerned that we will get a backlash, the same kind of backlash as we had after the early 90s in Russia, when the West said it was helping and did not help. So what I would like to see at least is $5 billion of real investment money on the table. Ukraine has suffered enormously from the Russian aggression. The whole decline in GDP comes from the Russian aggression. And there's hardly any foreign direct investment for the last 3 years because of Russian aggression. Previously, it was $6 to $8 billion a year. So the West is not even compensating for that. So instead, we are seeing pretty much zero foreign direct investment in real terms. So I fully agree with you. I'm with you 100%.
My clients don't invest because there's no reform.
Yeah, but if you take reforms in the economic area, on energy, on banking, on the budget, on the tax system, there have been grand reforms. Where there has not been reform, as you rightly pointed out, is in the judiciary. You could have the public administration in general. And this is what is needed now, and you can also take the parliament. From the e-declarations, we know that the average cash holding of a Ukrainian parliamentarian is $700,000. That's what they keep at home on average in
And what's their salary, Anders? What's their salary?
$250 a month.
Okay, it's Ambassador Piper's turn, please.
No, let me second what Anders said. I think the West should come up with more money, but I would actually though think that the West also should be more demanding in terms of what we sort of expect from Ukraine. I'm just sort of finishing up a book looking at Ukraine and U.S. relations, and I think American and Western policy were pretty successful on things like nuclear weapons and getting the Russians to contribute, or getting the Ukrainians to contribute troops to the Iraq Stabilization Force. We really haven't succeeded, though, in building or getting the Ukrainians to the point where it was the kind of state that they say they want, a democratic market economy, and that we want. And so I think we should make more money available, but we should be much more hard-nosed in terms of saying, you get this money, but these are the things that you have to do. When Vice President Biden was in Ukraine and basically publicly called for the removal of the prosecutor general, we should be, I think, more hard-nosed in saying these things will not happen until you listen to this. And that's we did. $1 billion. Yeah. Okay. It still took 4 or 5 months. We need to do more of that. I think because we're going to be basically asking the government and the elite structure to do things that on their own they are not going to want to do, because these things will all impinge upon their economic and their political interests. But those are the things that actually will help Ukraine build a more resilient state that begins to draw on investment and it can begin to grow. And had we been more successful in encouraging Ukraine to do this 15 to 20 years ago, I don't think Ukraine would be in the situation it finds itself today. Just briefly on the economic sanctions, I think that there are actually possibilities to up economic sanctions in terms of targeting further sectors of the Russian economy. There are some things that we could do. But I think in the current environment, I worry when I look at Europe. I mean, the challenge in Europe is going to be holding on to the current set of sanctions. And I still have questions in this administration. And I'm more confident now than I was 2 months ago. But I still am not fully confident that we can sustain the existing sanctions. So I'd like to see us make sure we hold on to these existing sanctions, and then if we can then push to raise the level and inflict more economic pain on the Russians for their outrageous actions in both Crimea and Donbass.
Okay, thank you very much. much. That is our cue. I would invite you to take, there's 2 articles on your way out. One is on Crimea generally, and one is on the bridge